Last week, New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet announced a $3 billion investment in so-called green hydrogen. Standing alongside him was mining magnate Twiggy Forrest, who has himself pledged to produce some 15 million tonnes of green hydrogen by the end of the decade. Both claim the energy source is a net zero game changer. But is it all it's cracked up to be? Judith Sloan has written brilliantly about this in the Australian newspaper today. She joins me now. Judith, thank you for some common sense on this. What do you reckon? Hydrogen, green hydrogen, a circuit breaker or a pipe dream?
Well, that was the question I posed, and I think it's a very worthwhile question trying to answer, to tell you the truth, because I think where we've got to in the debate about net zero emissions is that if one utters a few cynical remarks, then the response often is, oh, well, hydrogen, green hydrogen, that will fill the gap between what we might otherwise achieve and the net zero figures. So call me cynical, but I did think it was worth going and having a look.
Now, not all hydrogen's created equal. Explain to my viewers the difference between a blue hydrogen and this so-called green hydrogen.
Well, in fact, there are a variety of colours, but I guess the most important point about the hydrogen debate in one sense is that you have to use a lot of energy to isolate the hydrogen before you actually move on to the next stage and use hydrogen as a source of energy. So it is quite seriously behind the eight ball because of that. And I even mentioned the laws of thermodynamics in some of the comments. I think I got 3 cheers for an economist mentioning those laws. When it comes to blue energy, that tends to be a more efficient process of generating the hydrogen. It's basically from natural gas, from a hydrocarbon. And then the idea is that the CO2 emissions are stored through some sort of carbon capture and storage. At the moment, that looks like the much more economical way of producing hydrogen. Green hydrogen, which is what Twiggy is pushing, and seems to have got some very enthusiastic supporters through with particularly the Queensland and New South Wales government, is to use renewable energy as the means of creating the hydrogen and basically splitting the water, so electrolysis. So it's a very energy intensive process before you actually get to the hydrogen. And then there are, I think, a lot of complicating issues about how you store the hydrogen, how you transport the hydrogen, and particularly how you might want to export the hydrogen.
So help me out then. Why on earth are we going through all of these contortions about hydrogen, given all of those issues that you've just explained there about the movement and the storage and basically how unproven it is? We know the International Energy Agency says most of the stuff we're talking about to get us to net zero is not even invented yet. Why are we going through all of this when overseas we're looking at Britain soon to announce, France already announced quite massive expansions in their nuclear power industry?
Well, in fact, it's a really important point, it's colour-coded. So there is what's called pink hydrogen, which is actually possibly quite useful, which is to use nuclear power as the means of creating the hydrogen, and that will be used overseas without a doubt. I mean, I guess the point that the activists and indeed the business interests would make, that when you do eventually burn the hydrogen, that's emissions free, and that I think therefore is what is seen as the advantage of it. But bear in mind, Peter, they have been talking about this for actually literally decades, but also quite seriously talking about it. In Japan, for example, they created from about 1972 a very, very lengthy and well-resourced program to try and get hydrogen up. And don't get me wrong, hydrogen is used. Hydrogen has to be used in certain processes like oil refinery, for example. But it's been a very slow road. Now, I think there is genuine interest from Japan and from South Korea in particular for hydrogen, and they may not want to generate hydrogen there for various reasons. But we shouldn't think that Australia is the only country in on this game. So the United States under Biden, Canada, France, they're all also trying to get on the hydrogen bandwagon.
I want to ask you about this plan to burn waste timber, basically, to turn it into hydrogen at a Port Arthur Anthony plant down in Gippsland on the edges of Victoria. They say the timber waste is a big issue. It's carbon neutral, blah, blah, blah. But of course, you know, at one hand, it's saying that this is a green source of energy potentially. On the other hand, of course, we're banning anyone using their fires in their living rooms at home.
Well, that is sleight of hand, of course. It is exactly the same as Britain using what's called biomass, but actually is wood chips. And that is counted as a clean source of energy. I mean, that goes back many years to some absolutely extraordinary United Nations decision, which kind of takes a view that because trees are planted and then they grow and then they're cut down and there's some sort of cycle, so they can be counted as some sort of emissions-free source of energy, which is rubbish, actually, because when they burn a lot of CO2 emissions. So that's another example, I think, of that. But look, I guess, you know, they're not calling, I mean, maybe they are calling it green energy, but green hydrogen. But I think the point is that, look, you know, there are a lot of chances out there, a lot of grifters, might I even say. They're looking for, by and large, often looking for quite large government subsidies as part of the deal.
Well, incoming spinner, the government's putting the billions and billions of dollars on the table. It doesn't surprise me, like with everything, right back to pink bats and beyond, that they're coming out of the woodwork to jump on all this taxpayer money. I can't let you go without asking you about this plan from the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry today to double the skilled migration intake. They want 200,000 people into Australia over the next 5 years. They're saying this is a once-in-a-generation sort of reform. I don't think it's a reform, but that's their argument. What do you make of it, Judith?
Well, I'd actually thought that ACCI had kind of disbanded because they've been so quiet, and now they come up with this sort of drivel, really. I mean, of course, it's on the back of the New South Wales government's having some sort of media leak that they wanted, I think it was 2 million, didn't they? They wanted 2 million migrants in 5 years.
They did.
Look, here's our big chance to actually get serious about locals taking jobs and companies training locals to do the jobs that are needed and build the skills that are needed. I mean, the idea that we should be doubling skilled migrants, including from the countries who actually, by and large, can't afford for their best to be going, is just an extraordinarily lazy proposition by this group. And it as you say, they look like, you know, the grifters and the scammers too, I'm afraid.
And here we are thinking that that rare moment in time when we all paused in this pandemic, we might have had a long, hard look at some of these structural foundation policy issues, but we haven't, and we're about to head back to business as usual. Judith Sloan, always good to talk to you. Thank you.
Pleasure, Peta.